So in the end, basically, new science was repressed under monotheism in an effort to allow the church to maintain its power over the paradigm. However, the church brought on its own downfall, because it asked a young astronomer, medical doctor, teacher, and priest by the name of Nicholas Copernicus to help them with a problem of setting the church calendar for religious events and holidays. The reason why the church had a problem with this is that the church claimed that the earth was the center of God's firmament, and that the sun, the stars, the planets, and everything else revolved around the earth. However, if this was true, then it was very difficult for the priest to set up a calendar where some of the holidays were based on a lunar cycle, which is a 28-day cycle, and some of the holidays were based on an annual or yearly cycle, which is a 365-day cycle. Since 28 days doesn't go evenly into 365 days, there were overlaps between the holidays, and it was very difficult to plan the schedule of holidays for the church. Consequently, Copernicus was asked to resolve the issue of the calendar problem. In his studies, Copernicus realized that he couldn't resolve the calendar question, leaving the earth in the center of God's universe. However, he came up with the idea that perhaps the sun was the center of our universe and that the earth and all the other planets were revolving around the sun. When he put this information into his equation, he was able to accurately predict the nature of the universe. So consequently, an excited Copernicus ran off to the church and said, "Yes, I've resolved your issues about the calendar. Here, look." And the church was very excited because, indeed, it was easy now to plot the holidays and festivals for the church. Then, of course, Copernicus had to admit the only way he could have done this is to remove the earth from the center of the universe and put the sun in. Well, obviously, this was a very serious problem because the church's belief was based on earth being in the center of God's firmament. So the church was in a quandary. They got the calendar they wanted, but not with the belief that they wanted to express. So there was a trade-off, and what happened was Copernicus's calendar was accepted for planning the church events, but his understanding of how he got that calendar was actually off limits, and no one was allowed to delve into the mystery of Copernicus. Well, Copernicus was a young man, and he also recognized that had he told the public about how he got his calendar, that he, of course, would then be invited to that Inquisition court. Knowing the outcome of that court in advance, it was a very smart move on his part that he did not tell anybody about how he derived the calendar. Throughout his life, Copernicus kept the secret of the fact that the sun was the center of the universe, so he would not upset the church's absolute knowledge status. However, on his deathbed in 1543, Copernicus published his scientific results revealing that the sun was the center of the universe. What he was essentially saying was, well, listen, I'm dead, and what I'm leaving you is the science. And consequently, the church couldn't erase the science by persecuting Copernicus, and they actually had to deal with that science that was now exposed to the public. A consequence of Copernicus releasing this book is that the date of his death, 1543, is recognized as the date of the scientific revolution, the development of modern science. From that point, science was starting to ask questions that the church heretofore would not let them ask. One of the first and most important scientists to change the shape of the world was Isaac Newton. Because Isaac Newton, rather than focusing on the invisible spiritual realm as a source of life, decided to see if he could understand the nature of nature by just looking at the physical realm. So Isaac Newton created a mathematics called differential calculus, and then using this mathematics, he put in the data about the solar system, such as the planet's mass and its gravity, which was a factor of its mass, and other information such as the vector of its movement and its acceleration. And the significance of solving these equations for Newton is that he was able to accurately predict the movements of the universe. But there's a very profound significance for Newton in this regard, because what Newton did was only put the physical characters of the universe into his equation. He did not include God, spirit, or energy, or invisible forces in his equation. And since he was able to accurately predict the movement of the universe with this equation, it really said that you could understand the nature of the universe without invoking God and spirit. So consequently now there was a complete separation between the mission of science and the mission of the monotheistic paradigm leader, the church. Then the difference is this. Science said, we'll leave the invisible forces and spirit to the church, and yet we'll focus on the material realm. Well, of course, science was making great strides and providing miracles to the people through the development of new technologies. However, science was not able to take over the basal paradigm for the church, because simply this: science had yet to come up with an answer for the first question of how we got here. The answer to that question wasn't made available until 1859, and that was the year that Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. And the significance of this study was that Charles Darwin, using the same physical relevance that Newton applied to nature, said you could understand the theory of evolution without invoking God in this process, that it all comes about as a result of variations in heredity that are passed from one generation to the next generation. And consequently, since most people at that time were breeding plants and animals as a hobby or a lifestyle, many of them saw the truth in Darwin's belief that evolution was ultimately the result of variations introduced through breeding. And consequently, it was a very easy step for them to accept, yes, over millions of years, evolution and variation of breeding could provide for all the different animals and plants that are in the biosphere. So at that point, evolution came to be a scientific reality and challenged the foundation of the monotheistic paradigm, because now science had answers to the three questions that were generally accepted by most of the population. So in regard to science's perception for the perennial questions, here's what they responded to. In regard to how did we get here, science used Darwin's theory of random acts of heredity. In regard to why we are here, well, according to Darwin, it was all just random, a genetic accident, so consequently, there was no reason or purpose to evolution. But the third question, answered by science, threw a monkey wrench in our civilization for this reason. Because when asked, now that we are here, how do we make the best of it? What science offered was something called live by the law of the jungle. Rather than living by the scriptures that monotheists had said, science accepted that life was a struggle for survival. The belief that life was a struggle was predicated on a philosophy precipitated by Thomas Malthus that said, animals will always outproduce the ability of vegetation to support them. In other words, animals will reproduce faster than the food needed to support them. This would inevitably lead to a struggle where the animals will be competing for food. And in this particular struggle, as Darwin suggested, the winner of the struggle would be those that are the most fit. And consequently, we were left with a belief called the survival of the fittest in the struggle for existence. Well, the answers to the perennial questions by science obviously was accepted by most of the population. And in this particular time period, then there was a transition where we left behind the belief as the spiritual realm being predominant and started to accept the fact that the material realm was really the realm that controlled life. The fullest expression of what we call scientific materialism, emphasizing the physical realm, came in 1953. For this is the year that Watson and Crick provided the world with the awareness of the nature of DNA and the double helix. And at this point, it was now fully accepted by the world that our lives were controlled by matter, the DNA in the cells. And obviously after this point, then science was a predominant belief system over the spiritual beliefs of monotheism. However, we didn't just jump from a spiritual world directly into a material world. There was a changing of belief with a gradual increase in emphasis on the material realm, as monotheism was still the predominant belief system. Ultimately, after the Reformation period, Protestantism offered a new vision. It suggested that rather than just being damned, the material world might actually reflect that something is in God's favor, meaning that if some people actually started to express wealth, they might be reflecting that God was shining on them, and therefore they were closer to God. So all of a sudden, rather than just being damned, there was a new vision that material was not necessarily a negative thing. So materialism started to slowly creep in to our monotheistic belief. And yet science was producing, again, all these wonderful miracles, yet before Charles Darwin, it still wasn't able to overtake the basal paradigm. However, there was a point where the value in the spiritual realm and the value in the material realm all of a sudden became equal. And why this is important, because at this very brief window in the transition from monotheism to materialism, we actually were replaying a philosophy that started off our civilization. That philosophy was the philosophy of the animists, that believed that spiritual realm and material realm were of equal value and together actually created a unified whole. So there was a very interesting opportunity for civilization to re-experience this animist realm with an update from science. This period, the revision of the animistic philosophy, was precipitated by something called the Age of Enlightenment. And the Age of Enlightenment is actually an extension of a philosophy by two fundamental philosophers, John Locke of England and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher from France. Both of these philosophers talked about a utopian world. And what's very interesting about this is that the philosophy of Rousseau, which was principal in shaping the Age of Enlightenment, used an idea of a utopian world by basing it on the American Indians, the animists themselves. And Rousseau talked about these Indians and actually gave them the status of the noble savages. And he talked about how, in an animistic world, the balance between spirit and matter led to a successful and prosperous culture of Native Americans that were living in peace and harmony for hundreds of years in the New World. Well, this vision of the noble savage seeded many people's minds, because in this world, the belief of a utopian society was possible actually energized people to seek that philosophy. And those people who bought into this enlightened belief that matter and spirit were one and the same acquired the title of deists. And deists represented a philosophy of God and nature united. And it's very interesting because, who are the fundamental deists that may have shaped civilization? And why this becomes important is because in that small window where deism was the new philosophy of civilization, it was related to the founding of the United States and the founding fathers.
The most remarkable thing about the American Revolution is not that there was a rebellion, because there had been rebellions before. What was really significant were the enlightened ideals that this revolution based itself on. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where'd that come from? I mean, certainly it didn't come from European law. We had the Magna Carta in England, but that really just guaranteed the rights of a small group of noble people. Where did this come from? As Bruce had mentioned, the ideas came from the Enlightenment, but if we stopped there, we'd be missing maybe the most important influence on America's founding. Where Locke and Rousseau and the other philosophers of the Enlightenment got their ideas from Jefferson's, Washington's, and Franklin's backyard, the New World. Now, interestingly enough, when people migrated here from the Old World, what they found was actually an existing civilization that had been well established for at least 400 years before the signers of the Declaration of Independence even lifted a quill. Some authorities say that perhaps as early as 1100 AD, the 6 tribes that populated what is now northeastern United States and southern Canada came together to form the Iroquois Confederacy. 6 diverse nations found a way to live together in peace and still retain tribal autonomy. And they developed a sophisticated system of balance of powers that was later adopted by the U.S. Constitution. Now, in this, as you would say, an animist culture, what they understood intrinsically was that authority didn't come from the top down. Authority came from the ground up. Authority came from independent individuals who had equality, who had the same rights as anybody else. In the tribe, there was an equality. And so consequently, whenever structures were created, it was not a top-down imposition of the structure, it was a bottom-up agreement. And that's exactly how the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederation came together. You've heard the name Hiawatha. Hiawatha was the negotiator who put this thing together back there, many centuries ago. And it was quite an accomplishment because all of a sudden, all of the resources that were being used to fight one another could now be used to share the wealth, a very powerful concept. So here's an amazing fact. A Native American from the Iroquois Nation was the first one to propose an idea of the United States, and it happened on July 4th. Benjamin Franklin was at a meeting, and the Iroquois chief named Kanasatego, he was a very articulate speaker, and he spoke about the power of unity. And he did a demonstration. He took an arrow, held it up, and he snapped it in two. But then he bound 12 arrows together with twine. And the 12 arrows represented at that time, the 12 different colonies.